This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Early last week, the Ukrainian army staged a surprise incursion into the Russian oblast of Kursk. While most analysts were originally skeptical about the strategic wisdom of committing a non-trivial fraction of Ukraine's limited number of troops to a high-risk raid, a week or so later, it looks like it's been more successful than most expected. Ukrainian troops have advanced something like 40 kilometers into Kursk, capturing and killing hundreds of Russian soldiers along the way, and provoking panic in the Kremlin. On top of that, on Monday morning, Ukraine began a new incursion into Belgorod, roughly 40 kilometers south of the one ongoing in Kursk. So in this video, we thought we'd take yet another look at what's happening in Kursk, and explain why, even if it's been remarkably successful so far, it's still a risky move, and Ukraine now has to decide how much it wants to reinforce its new gains. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into it, a quick disclaimer. While the Ukrainian government have finally acknowledged their incursion into Kursk, they're still being deliberately tight-lipped about specifics, which means that we basically have to rely on Russian military bloggers for any detail. So take everything here with a pinch of salt. Anyway, with that being said, let's take a look at what's happened over the past few days. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk began on Tuesday morning last week, and originally it wasn't clear whether the Ukrainian incursion would be like the relatively small incursions we saw into Belgorod last year, or something more substantial. A week in, and it's clear that this incursion is significantly more substantial than anything we've seen before, with thousands of well-trained troops supported by armour and artillery. In the first few hours, these troops quickly overwhelmed the thinned-out Russian defence along the border, allegedly mostly comprised of conscripts, and began moving east towards the city of Sudzha and north along the road to Koronevo. At the time of writing, it looks like Ukraine's more exploratory advances have been stemmed by Russian reinforcements, and most of the fighting now seems to be concentrated in and around Sudzha. Nonetheless, even if further sweeping territorial gains are unlikely, the incursion has still been a real success in at least 4 respects. First, it's forced Russia to redeploy troops from elsewhere along the front lines. When news of this incursion first broke, many analysts immediately warned that if the incursion forced Ukraine to redirect available troops away from the front lines in Kharkiv, and especially Donbass, but Russia was able to deal with the incursion using local troops, this could increase Russia's attritional advantage in the east, and maybe pave the way for a Russian breakthrough. However, local troops have apparently been unable to stem the Ukrainian advances, and there are widespread reports of Russia redeploying troops from Kharkiv, where Russia opened a sort of second front earlier this year. While there's little evidence to suggest that Russia has had to redeploy a significant number of troops from Donbass, which would be strategically optimal from Ukraine's perspective, the speed of Russian advance in Donbass doesn't seem to have changed markedly, and if the incursion continues, a further redeployment might be required. Second, Ukraine has actually captured a non-trivial amount of territory inside Russia. If they can reinforce their troops there, or set up meaningful defensive fortifications, they could consolidate control over parts of Russia in a way they haven't been able to in the past. As we mentioned in the previous video, this would seriously complicate any attempt by Russia to freeze the conflict along the current lines of control, which is something they've allegedly been pushing for in negotiations recently, and open up the possibility that Ukraine could even trade Kursk back to the Russians in exchange for at least some of its own territory in future negotiations. Third, the Ukrainians have captured an enormous number of prisoners of war, with Russian telegram channels currently suggesting as many as 1,000 Russian troops have already surrendered. This is mainly because the Russian troops in Kursk were mostly conscripts with little battle experience, which meant that they just surrendered when the Ukrainian contingent arrived. This means Ukraine has more men to trade for its prisoners of war, which is something Zelensky stressed in his speech to the nation on Friday evening, when he talked about replenishing our exchange fund. This was also the first time that Zelensky had explicitly acknowledged the incursion into Kursk. Fourth, it's put significantly more internal pressure on the Kremlin by spooking both ordinary Russians and regional administrators. This was the main rationale behind the Belgorod raids last year, but they were only moderately successful in this respect. Even if they made it into Russia, the Ukrainians or anti-Putin partisans who took part in these raids were usually expelled relatively quickly, and the high casualty rate made Ukrainians question their strategic wisdom. This time, however, what's happening in Kursk forced the acting governor to declare a state of emergency on Wednesday, and Russia is now trying to evacuate nearly 100,000 people from the region. Putin looked visibly shocked in his address on Wednesday, and there were even reports that Putin has handed control of the Kursk operation to the secret services and the FSB, taking it away from the army and General Gerasimov, which would be a worrying sign of elite infighting in the Kremlin. Then, just as the new front lines were stabilising, on Monday morning a Ukrainian tank platoon started moving into Belgorod, roughly 40 kilometres south of the incursion into Kursk. Open source intelligence suggests that a Ukrainian tank began firing directly on the Kolytilovka checkpoint, just across the Ukrainian border. At the same time, Ukrainian troops were spotted moving towards Belitsa, which lies sort of between Sudzha and Kolytilovka, suggesting Ukraine could be trying to join its two contingents. While it's too soon to evaluate this new offensive, if even it is one, what happened on Monday morning does suggest that their success in Kursk has encouraged Ukraine to try out a new strategy, involving an increasing number of attacks into Russia itself in an attempt to shift the focus of the battle away from the attritional warfare in Donbass, where Russia continues to enjoy a slight advantage. Nonetheless, this new strategy leaves Ukraine with a constant dilemma. Broadly speaking, the more Russian territory they try to hold on to, the more costly it'll be, especially because, in Kursk at least, much of the territory nominally controlled by Ukraine is either in remote rural areas or isolated salients, which would be hard to defend. Ukraine could conduct a partial withdrawal to more defensible ground, perhaps centred around Sudzha, but less territory means less leverage against Russia in negotiations. In short, Ukraine would have to decide how much Russian territory it could afford to hold, and something similar will be true in Belgorod. Nonetheless, it's at least true to say that this new strategy has shaken things up a bit, making everything in the war feel a bit less certain, which is sort of what Ukraine needs, given the predictable, grinding nature of the attritional warfare in Donbass, which wasn't helping Kyiv either politically or militarily. There's a lot of difficult decisions to make here, and making huge decisions is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So, while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive datasets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. That might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you learn this by answering questions like which airline is least likely to have a delay due to weather, and how much more unruly airline passengers have gotten since the pandemic. Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.